Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending when you're watching this video. This is Flip Video 5.2b, and today we'll be talking about the effects of immigration. The previous video talked about the groups of immigrants that came to Washington State and how they helped our state become really what it is now through their hard work and their labor. And we touched a little bit upon how they were treated. This video will go a little more in depth, specifically looking at the Chinese and a little bit of the Asian immigrants. First off, a little bit of background. I want to talk about a group of people called nativists. Now, a nativist was an American who did not like seeing immigrants, mainly because nativists were against others who looked, spoke, and worshiped differently from themselves. Really, nativists could be very racist. Not always, but they definitely could be. Now, nativists objected to immigration for two main reasons. First, job competition. Immigrants were willing to work for less money. Really, immigrants came over because they knew America was a place where they got money. Now, back in their homelands, take China for example, if they were to get $1 American and to take that $1 American and send it over to China, they could end up getting hundreds, maybe thousands of their own currency. So even though they weren't paid much by our standards, that money equaled a lot of money in their home countries. That's job competition there. American citizens weren't willing to get paid, $1.25 for 10 hours worth of work when other immigrants were. Another reason nativists did not like immigrants was because they felt that immigrants weakened American culture and values. They felt that the immigrants weren't willing to adapt to American culture. As we talked about with the Chinese community made Chinatowns in other places, and in Seattle they made Chinatowns because they really weren't able to buy land amongst other white American citizens. So it's really no wonder why they weren't able to adapt, or maybe willing to adapt. They couldn't. They weren't allowed to mix with other citizens. They stayed with people who made them feel safe and wanted. So in some aspects, these nativists created the things that worried and bothered them so much. At least, that's Mr. Volkman's opinion on that. By the way, pause the video for a second. I'd like you to read this definition of nativism and see if you can look more at this comic here. It's worth you pausing the video. Just 5 seconds. Come on. Hit that pause button. Hit spacebar. It'll pause it for you. Now let's talk about the Chinese immigrants, because they really were the first immigrant group that was targeted and felt the effects of these nativists or nativism type feelings. As a transcontinental railroad finished, jobs were gone for a lot of these Chinese immigrant workers. Because remember, a lot of these Chinese workers helped to make the railroads. They did the hardest, most dangerous jobs. Railroads done. What are they going to do for jobs now? So they competed for jobs. As a result, people were not liking this. They were afraid that other American citizens will lose their jobs. So there's a lot of these feelings going on. And in 1882, the American government put into place the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was can you see that? Wait, there you go. 10-year ban on Chinese immigrants coming into our country. The only people from China who were allowed into our country were non-laborers. They could be students or government officials. Now, these non-laborers had to get a certificate from China proving that they were immigrants. And from what I researched, that was really difficult and really hard. Now, after 1882, if there was any Chinese workers, they had to leave. They weren't allowed to stay in. And if there were non-laborers working in our country, the state of whatever place they're in could not grant them citizenship. Present-day historians, again, looking back on history as a whole, view this as the first racist-based immigration policy of the U.S. And in fact, this policy of exclusion and quotas, which we'll talk about later, stayed in place till about the mid-1900s, about the 1940s. Now, in the mid-1800s, an economic depression hit our country. Not good. People couldn't find work. And when people can't find work, they start getting a lot of anxious, angry feelings. Laborers felt that by expelling the Chinese workers, the solution could be found to this economic depression. So throughout the country, and a lot through the Pacific Northwest, Chinese people were rounded up and kicked out of cities. In Tacoma, for example, they had a plan of rounding up 700 Chinese people. They drug them out of their homes and they kicked them out of the city. This really happened. In Issaquah, I believe it was 7 or 8 people were actually killed. In Bellingham as well, which is pretty close to us, they rounded up Chinese citizens, or not, people from China, and they kicked them out of China, and then they had big celebrations that they got rid of these Chinese workers. And if you go online and research it, and research the way they talked about these people from China, it's not pretty, and it's like, whoa, it's kind of freaky, kind of scary that actually happened. After the expulsions, after people were kicked out of the country, quotas came in which restricted the amount of immigrants that were allowed into the country. Of course, Asian countries were hit harder. And a lot of what I read was because Asian people just look different, very different culture from the white Europeans that were coming into the country. I want to take a moment, and I want to show you a timeline here. Oh, that's not the timeline. That isn't either. Here we go. This is the timeline. And I know I don't normally do this on the flip videos, but I want to take a moment. I want to slowly go through this timeline so you can see some of the violent things that were happening to people from China. I'm not going to read through it. I'm going to allow you to read through it while I scroll slowly down. Pause the video if you need to. And I just want to end with a couple of final thoughts. First off, I know that I could not convey in this video, without making it like a half an hour, what actually happened to people from Asia. I read a lot what happened to the Chinese, and it was a terrible thing. There are some essays that we're going to read in class, and we're going to have a good conversation, hopefully, about what happened with the immigrants, specifically the Asian community in Washington. One of the things I've read more than once is the fact that we do not have a lot of a strong Asian community compared to San Francisco and compared to Vancouver. And it's because of what happened during this time frame in our country. People were afraid. They didn't want to lose their jobs. They saw a lot of different types of people coming in. They saw these people maybe changing our culture in ways they didn't necessarily understand or like, and they reacted. So that's the end of this flip video. There will be an extra credit question posted on Edmodo. Also, there will be questions on Edmodo, 4 more questions for you to answer. Thank you. Have a great evening. Is this thing still on? I hope your students are still looking at this timeline, because Mr. Volkman left at 1910 up on the screen, and all of a sudden he's showing 1930. You better read it, guys, because I can see you.